Some prayers are answered with blessings, others are answered with blood. Tonight, I'm taking you to Salem's Ridge, Massachusetts, where the town's most devoted woman turned her husband's church into a sanctuary for secrets and a slaughterhouse for sinners. Picture this. It's March 1963, and every Sunday morning for 9 years, the faithful of Salem's Ridge have filled the pews of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, seeking salvation and solace from Pastor William Hartwell and his angelic wife, Grace. Grace Hartwell is everything a pastor's wife should be in 1963. Soft-spoken, charitable, always ready with a warm meal for the grieving and wise counsel for the troubled. But when 4 prominent church members die within 2 months of each other, all after confiding their deepest sins to Grace during her famous kitchen confessions, the new county coroner begins to suspect that Grace's compassion might be masking something far more sinister. Dr. Robert Chen will discover that behind Grace's saintly smile lies a woman who believes she's been chosen by God to cleanse her community of its most shameful secrets, one poisoned prayer at a time. The investigation will reveal that Grace Hartwell wasn't just Salem's Ridge's most trusted confidant, she was its most dangerous judge, jury, and executioner, using her position as spiritual counselor to identify sinners worthy of divine punishment. But which confession sealed the first victim's fate? And how many more souls were already marked for Grace's twisted version of salvation?
Welcome back to Golden Age Mysteries, where America's most buried secrets refuse to stay silent in the soil of small-town graveyards. I'm your storyteller, and tonight we continue our Small Town Secrets series with a tale from Salem's Ridge, Massachusetts, a town that carries the weight of its notorious neighbor's history, where the shadow of the Salem witch trials still whispers through colonial streets, and where faith and fear have always walked hand in hand. In March of 1963, America was still reeling from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Civil rights tensions were reaching a boiling point, and traditional religious values were being challenged by a rapidly changing world. But in Salem's Ridge, population 4,200, the old ways still held absolute power. Church attendance was practically mandatory, moral authority rested with religious leaders, and a woman's virtue was measured by her devotion to God, family, and community service. Salem's Ridge had been founded in 1692 by families fleeing the witch trial hysteria in nearby Salem, seeking refuge from what they saw as mass religious delusion. By 1963, it represented everything conservative New England valued: historic churches, generational families, and unshakable moral certainty. It was a community where reputation was everything, where shameful secrets could destroy entire bloodlines, and where confession was supposed to bring redemption, not death. This was also a town where the pastor's wife held almost as much authority as her husband, where Grace Hartwell's kitchen had become an unofficial confessional for women too embarrassed to speak their sins aloud in church, and where trust in spiritual leadership was so absolute that no one questioned why Grace's counseling sessions so often preceded tragic accidents.
You know, as I dig deeper into these stories from 1960s America, I'm always fascinated by how differently faith and community worked in small towns back then. The pastor's wife wasn't just a person, she was almost a sacred institution, someone you'd trust with your deepest fears and darkest secrets without question. This makes me curious about all of you watching tonight from around the world. In the comments below, tell me what city and country you're writing from, and share this. In your community, who is that one person everyone trusts completely? The local priests, the family doctor, the school principal, maybe that neighbor who's always there when you need help. because after what happened in Salem's Ridge in 1963, I think you'll realize that sometimes the people we trust most with our vulnerabilities are the ones who understand exactly how to use those secrets against us. Drop your location and tell me about your community's most trusted figure. I promise I won't tell them what you shared. And if you're from Massachusetts or anywhere near Salem, I'm especially curious to hear from you. Does your town still carry those shadows of old New England secrets?
Grace Eleanor Hartwell arrived in Salem's Ridge in the spring of 1954 as a 26-year-old newlywed, accompanying her husband William as he assumed leadership of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. With her auburn hair always perfectly pinned, her modest but elegant tresses, and her voice that never rose above a gentle whisper, Grace seemed to embody everything the congregation hoped for in a pastor's wife. But Grace brought more than just piety to Salem's Ridge. She brought an almost supernatural ability to make people want to confess their deepest shame. Within months of her arrival, women throughout the congregation began seeking private counsel, drawn by Grace's non-judgmental demeanor and her remarkable gift for making sinners feel understood rather than condemned. Grace had this way of looking at you, remembered Eleanor Fitzpatrick, one of the few church members who survived Grace's ministry. She'd tilt her head just slightly, smile with such compassion, and somehow you'd find yourself telling her things you'd never told another living soul. It felt like talking to an angel. What Eleanor and the others didn't realize was that Grace's gift wasn't divine inspiration. It was methodical psychological manipulation, combined with an encyclopedic memory for human weakness. Grace had spent her childhood in a Massachusetts state psychiatric facility, not as a patient, but as the daughter of Dr. Edmund Morrison, the institution's chief psychiatrist. She had grown up observing her father's interrogation techniques, learning to recognize the subtle signs of guilt, shame, and psychological vulnerability. Grace's background was carefully hidden from the Salem's Ridge congregation. They knew only that she came from a medical family and had studied human nature extensively. What they didn't know was that Grace had been expelled from nursing school for conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on patients, or that she had married William specifically because his position would give her access to the kind of vulnerable, guilt-ridden subjects she craved to study. But Grace wasn't content to simply collect secrets. She believed she had been chosen by God to act on them. By 1957, Grace's informal counseling sessions had evolved into what church members affectionately called kitchen confessions. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, women would visit the parsonage under the pretense of helping with church activities, but invariably ended up pouring out their hearts to Grace over tea and homemade cookies. Grace's kitchen was carefully designed to encourage confession. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs positioned to avoid direct eye contact, and the constant activity of baking created an atmosphere that felt safe, domestic, and private. Grace would work at her counter, kneading bread or rolling pastry, while women sat at her kitchen table and revealed the sins that haunted their sleep. She never pressured anyone, explained Martha Hendricks, whose confession would later seal her fate. Grace would just listen, occasionally asking a gentle question or offering a scripture verse. You always left feeling lighter, like you'd been truly heard and forgiven. But Grace was doing more than listening. She was documenting. Hidden throughout her kitchen were small notebooks where Grace recorded every confession in her own coded shorthand. Names, dates, specific sins, family connections, potential consequences. Grace maintained detailed files on every member of her congregation, creating a comprehensive map of Salem's Ridge's hidden shame. The breakthrough in understanding Grace's system came years later when investigators discovered her Recipe for Redemption journal, a leather-bound journal where Grace had developed her theological justification for what she saw as divine intervention in human affairs. Grace's journal dated September 15, 1959. Mrs. Patterson confessed to adultery with the mailman. 3 children at home, husband works double shifts to support them. Her sin poisons the entire family. God shows me that sometimes mercy requires permanent intervention. Some souls can only be saved through the body's destruction. This was the moment Grace Hartwell transformed from counselor to executioner. But which confession would trigger her first act of divine justice? And how would she decide which sinners deserved salvation through death?
Helen Morrison was Grace's first victim, though the connection wouldn't be discovered until much later. On October 3, 1960, Helen collapsed during Sunday morning service, convulsing violently before dying in Grace's arms right there in the church pew. Dr. Albert Kowalski, Salem's Ridge's elderly family physician, attributed Helen's death to a sudden heart attack, tragic but not unprecedented for a woman dealing with the stress of her husband's recent bankruptcy. What Dr. Kowalski missed was the bitter almond scent that Grace had carefully masked with peppermint. Helen Morrison had been poisoned with cyanide, administered through the communion wine that Grace had personally prepared and served that morning. Helen's death had been planned for weeks. During a kitchen confession session in early September, Helen had revealed that she had been embezzling money from the church building fund to cover her family's mounting debts. Her husband's construction business was failing, her teenage son needed money for college, and Helen saw the church's renovation fund as a temporary loan she would somehow repay. Grace's journal, September 8, 1960. Mrs. Morrison steals from God's house to feed her family's pride. She corrupts sacred funds with her worldly desperation. The congregation trusts her with their donations, never knowing their money feeds her family's lies. Divine justice requires that the thief be removed before the theft poisons the entire church body. Grace spent 3 weeks researching Helen's routine, learning her habits, identifying the perfect opportunity for what she called divine intervention. The communion wine was ideal. Helen served as communion assistant, always tasting the wine beforehand to ensure it was properly prepared, and her death during the sacred ritual would appear to be God's own judgment. The funeral was everything Grace had orchestrated, a somber celebration of Helen's life with underlying whispers about God's mysterious ways. Grace delivered a moving eulogy about Helen's devotion to the church, her sacrifices for her family, and how sometimes God calls his most faithful servants home when their earthly burden becomes too great to bear. But Helen Morrison was just the beginning. Grace had already identified her next sinner, and this time, the method would be even more personal.
6 months after Helen Morrison's death, Grace began her second divine intervention. Margaret Walsh, a 42-year-old mother of 4, had confessed to Grace that she was having an affair with her brother-in-law, a relationship that had been going on for over 2 years. Margaret was consumed with guilt, but couldn't bring herself to end the relationship or confess to her husband. Grace's solution was characteristically methodical. Instead of quick poison, she chose a slower method that would appear to be a tragic accident. carbon monoxide poisoning through a faulty heater in Margaret's home. Grace's journal, March 12, 1961. Mrs. Walsh adulterates her marriage bed and corrupts her brother-in-law's soul. 4 innocent children witness their mother's sin daily, learning that sacred vows mean nothing. Her husband labors unknowingly while she destroys the family foundation. God requires that the adulteress be removed before her poison spreads to the next generation. Grace had learned that Margaret's husband worked night shifts at the textile mill, leaving Margaret alone in the house Tuesday through Thursday nights. It was during one of these lonely evenings that Grace paid a pastoral visit, ostensibly to provide spiritual comfort for Margaret's ongoing marital difficulties. The conversation that night was recorded in Grace's journal with chilling detail. Grace counseled Margaret about the importance of family integrity, the generational impact of parental choices, and the sometimes necessary sacrifice required for the greater good. She prepared chamomile tea to calm Margaret's nerves, tea that contained a powerful sedative that would ensure Margaret slept deeply despite any unusual smells or symptoms. After Margaret fell unconscious, Grace methodically damaged the heater's ventilation system, creating a slow carbon monoxide leak that would take hours to reach fatal levels. She then returned home, establishing her alibi by hosting a late-night Bible study group for the church's young mothers. Margaret Walsh was found dead the next morning by her 12-year-old daughter. The death was ruled accidental, a tragic consequence of an aging heater system and poor home maintenance. Grace organized the church's response to the tragedy, coordinating meals for the grieving family and establishing a fund for the children's education. But Grace's system had a flaw she hadn't anticipated. Someone was beginning to notice patterns that others missed.
Dr. Robert Chen had arrived in Salem's Ridge 6 months before Margaret Walsh's death, fresh from his residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, and hired as the county's new assistant coroner. At 29, Dr. Chen brought modern forensic techniques to a region that still relied heavily on visual examination and local medical tradition. Dr. Chen was also something Salem's Ridge had never seen before, a Chinese-American physician in a community that was 98% white and deeply suspicious of outsiders. His appointment had been controversial, approved only because no white physicians were willing to take the poorly paid coroner position in such a remote location. But Dr. Chen's outsider status proved crucial in recognizing what longtime residents had missed or dismissed. When he reviewed the case files for recent deaths in Salem's Ridge, several inconsistencies caught his attention that local physicians had overlooked. Helen Morrison died of what appeared to be sudden cardiac arrest, Dr. Chen explained to Sheriff David Murphy, but her symptoms were inconsistent with typical heart attack presentation. The violent convulsions, the facial flushing, the reports of bitter odor, these suggested possible poisoning. Sheriff Murphy was initially resistant to Dr. Chen's suggestions. Salem's Ridge was a peaceful community where suspicious deaths were rare, and the idea that someone might be deliberately killing prominent church members seemed absurd. But Dr. Chen was persistent, and his medical credentials were impeccable. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen requested permission to examine Margaret Walsh's body. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions about both deaths. Margaret Walsh had not died from accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. Her blood showed traces of barbiturates consistent with deliberate sedation, and more significantly, the heater damage in her home showed clear signs of intentional tampering. Scratches on metal that could only have been made by hand tools, not normal wear and tear. Someone with detailed knowledge of both women's routines and access to their homes had murdered them, Dr. Chen concluded. This wasn't random killing.
This was targeted elimination of specific individuals for specific reasons. But before Dr. Chen could share his findings with Sheriff Murphy, Grace Hartwell was already preparing her most audacious murder yet. And this time, the victim would be someone whose death would send shockwaves through the entire community.
Elizabeth Thornton represented everything Salem's Ridge valued in Christian womanhood. As the wife of the church's head deacon and mother of 6 children, she was prominent in every church activity, led the Women's Missionary Society, and had never missed a Sunday service in 23 years. When Elizabeth sought Grace's counsel in early 1962, it was for a sin so shameful she couldn't bear to confess it to her husband or even to Pastor Hartwell directly. Elizabeth's secret was devastating. She had been stealing money from the church's missionary fund to pay for her eldest daughter's abortion. The daughter, 17-year-old Mary, had become pregnant by a married deacon from a neighboring church, and Elizabeth had chosen to handle the crisis quietly rather than expose the scandal that would destroy both families. The confession took place during what would become Elizabeth's final kitchen session with Grace. The conversation, later reconstructed from Grace's detailed notes, revealed the depth of Elizabeth's moral anguish and Grace's calculated response. Elizabeth: I know what I did was wrong, Grace, but I couldn't let Mary's mistake destroy her entire future. The missionary money seemed like the only option. I planned to replace it gradually from our household funds. God sees everything, Elizabeth. He sees your daughter's sin, your theft, and the way you've chosen human wisdom over divine justice. Sometimes motherly love can become a form of spiritual blindness. Elizabeth: but what was I supposed to do? Let everyone know? Destroy Mary's reputation and her chances for a decent marriage? Perhaps God intended for Mary to face the consequences of her choices. Perhaps your intervention has prevented the divine lesson both she and the church needed to learn. Grace's journal entry from that evening revealed her decision process with chilling clarity. Grace's journal, February 14, 1962. Mrs. Thornton corrupts God's mission work to hide her daughter's fornication. The missionary fund, intended to save heathen souls, instead pays for the destruction of Christian life in the womb. Her theft enables sin, her cover-up prevents repentance, and her influence over other mothers spreads the poison of moral compromise. The church's spiritual mother must be removed before she births more corruption. Grace spent weeks planning Elizabeth's death, studying her routines and identifying the perfect method. Elizabeth's weekly habit of preparing communion bread alone in the church kitchen provided the ideal opportunity. But this murder would be different. This time, Grace would use Elizabeth's own devotion against her.
On March 15, 1962, Elizabeth Thornton arrived at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church at 5:30 a.m. to prepare communion bread for Sunday service, just as she had done every Thursday morning for the past 15 years. Grace had offered to help, claiming she wanted to learn Elizabeth's special recipe for the church's traditional communion loaves. Grace had prepared meticulously for this murder. Hidden in her baking supplies was a small vial of ricin, extracted from castor beans through a process Grace had learned from her father's psychiatric textbooks. Ricin was ideal for Grace's purposes. It was virtually undetectable in food, caused symptoms that could be mistaken for severe food poisoning, and had a delayed action that would allow Grace to establish a perfect alibi. The two women worked together in the pre-dawn darkness, mixing flour and water, kneading dough, sharing quiet conversation about church matters and family concerns. Grace carefully observed Elizabeth's baking technique, asking innocent questions about ingredients and timing, while waiting for the perfect moment to add her deadly contribution. Elizabeth always tasted the dough, Grace later told investigators, her voice carrying just the right note of sorrow. She said it was the only way to ensure the communion bread would be worthy of the sacred service. I tried to stop her that morning, told her the dough didn't need tasting, but she insisted on maintaining her standards. The ricin was mixed into a small portion of dough that Grace had prepared separately, ostensibly to test a new recipe variation. When Elizabeth automatically reached for a taste, as Grace knew she would, she consumed a fatal dose of poison, disguised as an act of devotion. Elizabeth returned home feeling slightly unwell, but attributed her nausea to early morning baking and lack of breakfast. Over the next 48 hours, her condition deteriorated rapidly. Severe vomiting, difficulty breathing, and progressive organ failure that doctors initially diagnosed as aggressive food poisoning. Elizabeth Thornton died on March 17, 1962, never knowing that her final act of service to her church had been turned into an instrument of execution. Grace organized the funeral with characteristic efficiency, delivering a moving tribute to Elizabeth's dedication and establishing a memorial fund in her honor. But Elizabeth's death would prove to be Grace's fatal mistake, because this time, someone had been watching.
Thomas Brennan had been the church janitor at St. Matthew's for 37 years, arriving each morning at 4:45 a.m. to prepare the building for daily activities. At 71, Thomas was nearly invisible to most church members, a quiet, humble man who performed his duties efficiently and never spoke unless directly addressed. But Thomas had spent decades observing the subtle dynamics of church life, and he had noticed patterns that others missed or dismissed. He had been present in the building during each of the unusual early morning activities that preceded the mysterious deaths in his congregation. On the morning of Elizabeth Thornton's final communion bread preparation, Thomas had been in the church basement repairing a leak in the baptismal font. He had heard Grace's voice in the kitchen above, engaged in conversation with Elizabeth, but something about the tone had struck him as unusual. Thomas had quietly made his way upstairs, concerned that there might be some emergency requiring his assistance. What he witnessed through the slightly open kitchen door would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I saw Mrs. Hartwell add something to the dough," Thomas later testified. "Something from a small bottle she kept hidden in her apron pocket. When Mrs. Thornton reached for the taste, Mrs. Hartwell didn't try to stop her. She watched with this expression I'd never seen before. Cold, satisfied, like she was waiting for something to happen." Thomas had also noticed Grace's presence during unusual circumstances before the other deaths. She had been at the church on the Sunday morning when Helen Morrison received the poisoned communion wine, personally assisting with preparation, despite that not being her normal responsibility. She had made a late-night pastoral visit to Margaret Walsh on the evening before Margaret's accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. But Thomas faced a terrible dilemma. He was a simple man with a fourth-grade education, making accusations against the most respected woman in Salem's Ridge. Who would believe that Grace Hartwell, the saintly pastor's wife, was systematically murdering members of her own congregation? Thomas's solution was to approach the one person in town who might listen to an outsider's perspective. Dr. Robert Chen, the new coroner, who had already expressed concerns about the recent deaths. The meeting between Thomas and Dr. Chen took place in secret on March 25, 1962, 8 days after Elizabeth Thornton's final communion bread preparation. Thomas's eyewitness account, combined with Dr. Chen's forensic evidence, finally provided the proof needed to expose Grace Hartwell's reign of terror. But when Sheriff Murphy arrived at the parsonage to arrest Grace, he discovered that Salem's Ridge's angel of death had vanished, and with her disappearance came the realization that her killing spree might not be over.
Grace Hartwell's disappearance on March 26, 1962, sent shockwaves through Salem's Ridge that reached far beyond the town's borders. The revelation that the community's most trusted spiritual counselor had been systematically murdering church members challenged everything the residents believed about faith, trust, and divine judgment. The manhunt for Grace extended across New England, with law enforcement agencies in 6 states coordinating to track down a woman who had transformed from angel of mercy to angel of death. But Grace had spent years planning for the possibility of exposure, and her escape route was as methodical as her murders. The investigation into Grace's background revealed the true extent of her deception. Her childhood at the psychiatric facility had provided more than just psychological training. She had also learned about various poisons and toxins from her father's research into chemical treatments for mental illness. Her expulsion from nursing school had been due to unauthorized experiments on patients using compounds she had stolen from the hospital pharmacy. Most disturbing was the discovery of Grace's complete theological justification for her actions. Hidden in a secret compartment of her bedroom desk was a manuscript titled Divine Intervention in Human Affairs, a theological guide to sacred elimination. Excerpt from Grace's manuscript. God grants certain chosen servants the wisdom to recognize irredeemable sin and the authority to act as instruments of divine justice. When confession reveals corruption that threatens the spiritual health of the community, elimination becomes a sacred duty. The physical death of the sinner enables the spiritual salvation of the righteous. Grace had also maintained detailed files on every member of St. Matthew's congregation, cataloging their confessed sins, psychological vulnerabilities, and potential threat levels. Of the 347 active church members, Grace had identified 23 individuals as requiring divine intervention, meaning death. Sheriff Murphy realized with horror that Elizabeth Thornton had only been the 3rd victim in what Grace planned as a systematic purge of her congregation's irredeemable sinners. The search for Grace ended on April 15, 1962, in a cabin near Lake Champlain in Vermont. But the confrontation would reveal that Grace's escape hadn't been about avoiding justice, it had been about completing her divine mission.
When Vermont State Police surrounded the remote cabin where Grace had been hiding, they expected to find a desperate fugitive ready to surrender or fight. Instead, they discovered Grace Hartwell calmly preparing what appeared to be her final meal, communion bread and wine set for a solitary service. Grace's capture was eerily peaceful. She offered no resistance, expressed no remorse, and seemed almost relieved that her earthly mission was finally coming to an end. During the transport back to Massachusetts, Grace provided a detailed confession that revealed the full scope of her twisted theology and murderous methodology. "God chose me to cleanse His church," Grace explained to Detective Frank Morrison during her initial interrogation. "Each person I helped transition from earthly corruption to divine judgment was saved from a lifetime of sin that would have damned their souls eternally.
I didn't murder them, I liberated them. Grace's confession revealed previously unknown details about her 3 confirmed murders and her plans for future victims. She had been systematically working through her list of condemned sinners, timing each death to avoid suspicion while maintaining her position as trusted spiritual counselor. Most chilling was Grace's explanation of her selection criteria. Victims weren't chosen based on the severity of their sins, but on their potential to influence others toward corruption. Helen Morrison's embezzlement threatened the church's financial integrity. Margaret Walsh's adultery risked normalizing marital infidelity. Elizabeth Thornton's cover-up of her daughter's pregnancy had prevented the congregation from learning about the consequences of premarital sex. I wasn't killing sinners, I was preventing sin from spreading to the innocent. Every person I eliminated had the potential to corrupt dozens of others through their example or influence. Grace also revealed that she had been in communication with like-minded individuals across the country, other religious extremists who believed in divine authorization for selective murder. The FBI investigation that followed Grace's arrest uncovered a network of similar cases in small religious communities throughout America, suggesting that Grace's methods were part of a larger pattern of theological extremism. But Grace's most disturbing revelation was yet to come. During her final interview before trial, she admitted that her ultimate target hadn't been reached yet, and that person was closer to home than anyone had suspected.
Grace's final revelation shattered the last vestiges of normalcy in Salem's Ridge. Her ultimate target for divine intervention wasn't a parishioner, it was her own husband, Pastor William Hartwell. William knew, Grace confessed during her final pre-trial interview. He had known about Helen, about Margaret, about Elizabeth. He had watched me eliminate corruption from his congregation, and instead of stopping me, he had provided information that helped me identify additional targets. The investigation into Pastor Hartwell's role revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond Grace's individual murders. William had been using his position to gather confessional information not just for spiritual guidance, but to identify church members whose secrets made them either valuable for blackmail or dangerous enough to require elimination. Grace's kitchen confessions hadn't been her own innovation, they had been William's suggestion, a way to supplement the information he gathered during formal confession sessions. The pastor and his wife had created a comprehensive surveillance system that monitored the moral and financial lives of their entire congregation. But Grace's twisted theology had eventually extended to judging her husband's sins as well. William's use of sacred confessional information for worldly manipulation, his complicity in murder, and his growing greed for control over the congregation had marked him for divine intervention. William had become the greatest corrupter of all, Grace explained. He used God's authority to enable sin rather than eliminate it. His removal would have been my final act of service to the church. Grace had been planning William's murder for months, intending to poison him during a special communion service she was organizing for their 10th wedding anniversary. His death would have appeared to be divine judgment on a pastor who had lost his way, leaving Grace free to assume informal leadership of the congregation and continue her purification mission. Pastor William Hartwell was arrested on April 20, 1962, and charged with conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to homicide. His trial revealed the depth of corruption that had infected St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, transforming a place of worship into a center for psychological manipulation and systematic murder. The scandal destroyed not only the Hartwells, but the entire religious community they had pretended to serve.
The trials of Grace and William Hartwell became national news, representing one of the most shocking religious scandals in American history. The case challenged fundamental assumptions about spiritual authority, the sanctity of confession, and the potential for religious extremism to justify murder. Grace's trial began on September 10, 1962, with the prosecution presenting overwhelming evidence of premeditated murder disguised as divine mission. Dr. Robert Chen's forensic evidence, Thomas Brennan's eyewitness testimony, and Grace's own detailed confessions left no doubt about her guilt. Grace's defense strategy was unprecedented. She claimed divine authorization for her actions, arguing that human law had no authority over God's chosen instruments. Her attorney, reluctantly assigned by the court, attempted to build an insanity defense, but Grace herself rejected any suggestion that her actions were the product of mental illness. "I am as sane as Moses when he received the 10 Commandments," Grace declared from the witness stand, her voice carrying the same gentle authority that had once comforted her victims. "God spoke to me as clearly as he spoke to Abraham when he commanded the sacrifice of Isaac. The only difference is that my sacrifices were completed." The prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Sullivan, methodically dismantled Grace's theological justifications. Expert witnesses in theology and psychology testified that Grace's interpretation of divine will bore no resemblance to any recognized Christian doctrine, and that her systematic planning demonstrated clear criminal intent rather than religious inspiration. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Edmund Morrison, Grace's own father, who had been compelled to testify about his daughter's childhood behavior at the psychiatric facility. Dr. Morrison revealed that Grace had shown disturbing signs of manipulation and control from an early age, conducting cruel experiments on facility patients and showing complete lack of empathy for human suffering. Grace learned to mimic compassion, Dr. Morrison testified, his voice breaking with the weight of paternal failure. She understood that appearing caring and trustworthy gave her access to vulnerable people, but she never actually felt compassion. She felt ownership. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Grace received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, making her one of the first women in Massachusetts history to receive such a severe sentence for serial killing.
William Hartwell's trial began 2 weeks later, and if anything, proved even more devastating to the community's faith. While Grace had claimed divine inspiration for her murders, William's motivations were revealed to be purely mercenary: power, control, and financial gain disguised as spiritual leadership. The prosecution demonstrated that William had been using confessional information for blackmail, extracting money and favors from parishioners in exchange for keeping their secrets safe. Church treasurer Robert Fitzpatrick testified that William had been siphoning funds from various church accounts, using his knowledge of members' financial situations to cover his embezzlement. Pastor Hartwell knew exactly who could afford to make additional voluntary contributions, Fitzpatrick explained. He would approach members privately, suggest that their spiritual growth might benefit from increased financial sacrifice, and hint that their recent private conversations with Mrs. Hartwell had revealed areas for improvement. Even more disturbing was the revelation that William had been deliberately encouraging his parishioners to confess increasingly intimate details about their lives, creating detailed psychological profiles that he and Grace used to identify potential victims and blackmail targets. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, now understanding why Grace's kitchen sessions had felt so invasive, testified about the subtle questioning techniques both Hartwells had employed. They would ask about your marriage, your children, your finances, always with such concern, such apparent love. You felt like they truly cared about every aspect of your life. Now I realize they were cataloging our weaknesses. The defense attempted to portray William as another victim of Grace's manipulation, arguing that his wife's psychological dominance had gradually corrupted his pastoral judgment. But recorded conversations between the couple, discovered hidden in the church basement, revealed William as an eager participant in their conspiracy. In one particularly damning recording from February 1962, William's voice could be heard discussing potential targets with chilling detachment. William: "The Morrison woman's theft is becoming harder to conceal. Someone's going to notice the discrepancies in the building fund eventually." Grace: "Then perhaps it's time for her burden to be lifted. God has shown me that her guilt is consuming her soul." William: "How long do you think it would take? I have the board meeting next week, and it would be convenient if the treasurer position became available." Grace: "Divine timing is perfect timing, darling. Trust in God's plan."
As the trials progressed through the fall of 1962, Salem's Ridge faced a crisis of faith that extended far beyond the criminal proceedings. The revelation that their most trusted spiritual leaders had transformed their church into a center for murder and manipulation shattered the community's foundational beliefs about trust, authority, and divine guidance. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church closed its doors on October 15, 1962, unable to continue functioning after the scandal. The building stood empty for months, its stained glass windows reflecting the autumn light onto vacant pews where 3 murder victims had once worshipped in trust and faith. Many congregation members left Salem's Ridge entirely, unable to bear the weight of their unwitting participation in Grace's psychological experiments. Others stayed, but struggled with profound questions about their own judgment and the nature of spiritual authority. Martha Hendricks, whose confession about shoplifting had placed her on Grace's target list, spoke for many survivors. How do you trust again after something like this? How do you open your heart to spiritual guidance when the last guidance nearly cost you your life? Grace knew my deepest shame, and instead of helping me find forgiveness, she planned my murder. The psychological impact extended to the children of Salem's Ridge, who had grown up viewing Grace Hartwell as a maternal figure and moral authority. Child psychologists brought in to help the community reported widespread anxiety, confusion about right and wrong, and difficulty trusting adult authority figures. Dr. Patricia Whitman, who worked with many of the children, noted, "These children learned that the person who taught them about God's love was actually an instrument of death. They're struggling to separate spiritual faith from the specific individuals who betrayed that faith." William Hartwell's trial concluded on November 20, 1962, with his conviction on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to homicide, embezzlement, and violation of clergy privilege. His sentence of 25 years to life marked the end of his religious career and the complete destruction of his family's reputation. Unlike Grace, who maintained her divine mission claims throughout imprisonment, William quickly broke down after sentencing.
In a tearful statement to the court, he attempted to explain his transformation from faithful pastor to murderous conspirator. "I began with genuine desire to serve God and help my congregation," Williams said, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. But Grace had this way of making everything seem logical. "She convinced me that we were protecting the church from corruption, that our knowledge of people's secrets made us responsible for acting on that knowledge. I convinced myself that each step we took was justified by the greater good. When Grace suggested the kitchen confessions, I thought we were expanding our ministry. When she began talking about divine intervention, I thought she meant prayer and guidance. By the time I understood what divine intervention actually meant, I was already complicit." The judge, the Honorable Francis McKenna, delivered a scathing condemnation of both defendants that resonated far beyond the courtroom. The defendants perverted the most sacred trust in human society, the relationship between spiritual guides and those seeking comfort, forgiveness, and moral direction. They weaponized confession, corrupted compassion, and used divine authority to justify unspeakable cruelty. Mrs. Hartwell claims to have acted as God's instrument, but no loving deity would choose murder as the path to salvation. Mr. Hartwell claims to have been manipulated by his wife, but his own recorded words reveal calculated participation in systematic betrayal of his sacred vows. These crimes represent not just the murder of 3 innocent people, but the attempted murder of an entire community's faith. The sentences I impose today cannot restore what has been lost, but they can ensure that these particular instruments of corruption never again pose as servants of light.
Grace and William Hartwell were both imprisoned at separate maximum security facilities, their marriage effectively ending when William's cell door closed behind him. Grace was sent to the Women's Correctional Institute in Framingham, where she quickly gained a reputation among both inmates and staff for her unsettling combination of gentle demeanor and complete lack of remorse. Prison records from Grace's early incarceration reveal that she attempted to continue her ministry within the prison population, offering spiritual guidance to fellow inmates, while secretly documenting their confessions and psychological profiles. When authorities discovered her hidden notebooks, Grace was placed in solitary confinement and forbidden from participating in prison religious services. Dr. Helen Morrison, a psychiatrist assigned to evaluate Grace during her imprisonment, noted her subject's remarkable psychological profile. Mrs. Hartwell demonstrates no traditional signs of mental illness, no evidence of hallucinations or delusions, and maintains perfect cognitive function. Her theological justifications for murder appear to be genuine beliefs rather than post hoc rationalizations for antisocial behavior. What makes Mrs. Hartwell particularly dangerous is her ability to present as a normal, compassionate individual while maintaining a completely inverted moral framework. She genuinely believes that murder was an act of love, that betrayal was a form of ministry, and that her victims should be grateful for their liberation from earthly corruption. William's prison experience proved far more difficult. Unlike Grace, who thrived on the power dynamics of institutional life, William struggled with guilt, depression, and the complete collapse of his identity as a religious leader. Prison records show multiple suicide attempts and psychiatric interventions throughout his incarceration. In a letter written to his sister in 1965, William attempted to explain his transformation. "I keep trying to find the moment when I stopped being a pastor and became a criminal. Was it when I first listened to Grace's kitchen confessions without stopping them? when I started using sacred information for church politics, when I realized Grace was planning murder and didn't call the police. The terrible truth is that there wasn't a single moment of transformation. Evil crept into my soul so gradually that I mistook it for righteousness until it was too late to turn back. I pray that God can forgive what I cannot forgive in myself.
The Salem's Ridge murders of 1962 to 1963 became a watershed moment in American religious history, forcing churches across the nation to examine their own procedures for pastoral counseling, confession protocols, and oversight of clergy behavior. The Episcopal Church implemented new guidelines requiring supervision of pastoral counseling and mandatory reporting procedures for clergy who suspected abuse within their communities. Law enforcement agencies also adapted their investigative procedures based on lessons learned from Dr. Robert Chen's forensic work. The case demonstrated the importance of modern scientific methods in detecting subtle poisoning cases and the value of outside perspectives in communities with insular power structures. Dr. Chen, whose persistence had ultimately exposed the murders, left Salem's Ridge in 1963 to join the FBI's newly formed Behavioral Science Unit, where he helped develop profiles for religious extremist killers. His work on the Hartwell case became a foundational study in understanding how spiritual authority could be weaponized for criminal purposes. Thomas Brennan, the church janitor whose observations had provided crucial evidence, became something of a local hero, though he never sought recognition for his role in stopping Grace's killing spree. He continued working at various churches throughout Massachusetts until his retirement in 1978. Always maintaining vigilant watch over the communities he served. "After what I saw in Salem's Ridge," Thomas reflected in a 1975 interview, "I learned that evil doesn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes dressed as an angel, speaking in whispers, offering comfort while planning destruction. The most dangerous predators are those who perfect the appearance of love." The town of Salem's Ridge itself never fully recovered from the scandal. The population declined from 4,200 in 1962 to fewer than 2,800 by 1970, as families left seeking fresh starts in communities untainted with the association of religious murder. The St. Matthew's Church building was eventually demolished in 1968, replaced by a small memorial park dedicated to the victims of religious extremism. Grace Hartwell died in prison on December 15, 1987, at the age of 59, having served 25 years of her life sentence. Even in death, she remained unrepentant, leaving behind a final written statement that chilled those who read it. "I go to meet my Creator with confidence in the righteousness of my earthly mission. The 3 souls I liberated from corruption have had 25 years to appreciate their salvation, and I trust they will intercede for me at the throne of divine justice. My only regret is that my work remained unfinished. There were 20 others who still needed divine intervention when human law interrupted God's plan." William Hartwell had died 8 years earlier, in 1979, after a final successful suicide attempt. His death was noted only briefly in local newspapers, with no religious service and no family members present at his burial. The story of Salem's Ridge serves as an enduring reminder that the greatest evil often wears the mask of righteousness, that trust placed in the wrong hands becomes a weapon of unimaginable cruelty, and that the line between divine inspiration and deadly delusion can be terrifyingly thin. In small towns across America,
This tale is still remembered whenever communities gather to worship, confess their sins, and place their faith in spiritual leaders. The legacy of Grace Hartwell's kitchen confessions echoes in every moment when vulnerable souls seek guidance from those who claim to speak with divine authority. For in the end, Grace Hartwell's greatest crime wasn't murder. It was the systematic destruction of the sacred trust that binds communities together in faith, hope, and love. Some wounds to the soul never fully heal, and some betrayals echo through generations, teaching us that even angels can fall, and that sometimes the most beautiful prayers are answered with blood.